Hello, dear members of the Soul and Real Stories family. Today, we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. A Night Before Forever. The white dress hugged every soft curve of Claire, accentuating the regal beauty of the bride-to-be. Under the gentle golden lights of the five-star hotel, she radiated like a precious gem among her closest friends. Crisp laughter echoed throughout the luxurious space, blending with the lively background music, creating an atmosphere that was vibrant, joyful, and full of life. Her friends surrounded her, continuously raising their glasses in celebration. Everyone rejoiced for Claire's upcoming big day. She smiled brightly, her eyes shimmering with happiness. In just a few more days, she would officially become the wife of Michael, the man she loved with all her heart. All she wished for was a happy future, a home filled with love. But amidst the cheerful atmosphere, one person did not share in the collective joy. From a secluded corner of the room, Vanessa watched silently, gripping her wine glass tightly. Her eyes remained fixed on Claire with a complex gaze, a bitterness no one could perceive. No one knew that behind the mask of a close friend, Vanessa was hiding a painful secret. She loved Michael. This feeling wasn't something new. Vanessa had loved Michael for a long time, even before he met Claire. She had once believed that one day he would realize her feelings, that they were meant to be together. But everything crumbled when Michael chose Claire. Why her? As the wedding day drew nearer, Vanessa's jealousy and resentment grew stronger. Claire had everything: Michael's love, his attention, a future filled with happiness. And she had nothing. That thought made Vanessa unable to accept reality. She couldn't let this wedding happen. Tonight, Vanessa had a plan, a perfect plan to destroy everything. She raised her wine glass, her lips curling into a warm smile, but deep within her eyes lay an unreadable chill. "Drink up, Claire. This is your last night as a single woman," she cheered, her voice as joyful as any good friend sharing in the bride's excitement. Claire laughed, unsuspecting. She lifted her vibrant cocktail, gently clinking glasses with Vanessa. "You're right. I have to enjoy it." She took a sip, feeling the cool liquid sweep over her tongue. The sweet fruit flavors mixed with a strong hint of alcohol, making her feel a bit more relaxed. Claire was never a strong drinker, but tonight was special. What harm was there in indulging a little? 1 glass, 2 glasses, 3. The music played on, the lights twinkled, laughter filled the air. Friends surrounded her, toasting endlessly, their voices ringing with cheerful shouts of congratulations. Claire laughed more, her body feeling warm, her mind hazy. The world around her seemed to spin, blurring at the edges. Vanessa watched quietly, the corner of her lips curling slightly as she observed Claire's reactions. She was losing control. Vanessa pretended to pour more wine into her glass, but in truth, she barely drank. She needed to stay sharp to execute her plan. Claire blinked, gripping the table lightly to steady herself. "Wow, I think I drank too much," she murmured, her voice slightly drawn out. Vanessa placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle yet firm. "You're drunk. Let me take you to your room to rest." Claire shook her head, trying to protest, but her body had gone weak, completely drained of strength. She didn't realize that step by step, drink by drink, she was being led into a trap by Vanessa, a plan so meticulously crafted that when she woke up, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Vanessa guided Claire down the hotel hallway, each step calculated with cold precision. Claire, completely unaware, was walking straight into a setup. The room Vanessa had prepared was only a few steps away. She had rented a suite in this very hotel and left the door slightly ajar to ensure there would be no delays. The man she had arranged was waiting inside. All it would take was a simple push, shove Claire inside, close the door, and the wedding would be over before the night was through. Everything seemed perfect, but then Vanessa made a fatal mistake. In her haste, she didn't notice that another room nearby also had its door open. Just as she was about to push Claire into the designated room, she miscalculated and led her toward the wrong one. Claire, in her drunken haze, felt a vague sense of resistance. She mumbled, I can walk. Where's my room?" Before Vanessa could correct the mistake, Claire stepped into the open doorway right in front of her. But it wasn't the room Vanessa had arranged. It was Alexander's room. Vanessa froze, her eyes widening. She had made a mistake. The room she had rented was just a few feet away, also open, but in the rush, she had lost her bearings and pushed Claire into the wrong place. Panic surged in Vanessa's chest as the door slowly swung shut behind Claire. She wanted to run, to pull Claire back, but if she did, her entire plan would be exposed. Vanessa stood paralyzed in the hallway, realizing that everything was now spiraling out of her control. She could do nothing. And the worst part was all of their fates had been changed forever because of one small mistake. Inside the high-end hotel suite, soft golden light bathed the space, reflecting off the polished ebony table at the center of the room. Everything in this suite exuded luxury, from the abstract paintings on the walls to the premium leather armchair in which Alexander sat. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. One hand held a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling slightly with each subtle movement of his wrist. In the stillness of the room, the faint clink of ice against the glass was the only sound. Alexander didn't care for noisy crowds. Outside, the party's music still thumped faintly through the walls, but he had chosen solitude instead, savoring a rare moment of peace. As a young and successful businessman, he was no stranger to extravagant galas, insincere socializing, and handshakes full of ulterior motives. But tonight, he wasn't in the mood for any of it. Leaning back in his chair, he gazed out through the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights stretched endlessly like a living, breathing painting. Sometimes he wondered, after all the achievements, the endless meetings, what truly mattered. Then a faint noise interrupted his thoughts. The door creaked open. Alexander frowned slightly, setting his glass down on the table. He didn't recall inviting anyone. The door pushed open further, and a woman stepped in, a complete stranger. Claire stumbled into the room, her steps unsteady, her body swaying slightly from intoxication. The white dress clung to her curves, highlighting her regal elegance while also making her appear more fragile than ever. Her cheeks were flushed, though whether from the alcohol or the warmth in her body, Alexander couldn't tell. Her eyes shimmered, unfocused, as if she wasn't fully registering her surroundings. Alexander's brows furrowed. Who was she? He was about to speak, to tell her she had entered the wrong room, when she suddenly lifted her gaze to his. For a moment, there was a flicker of confusion in her drunken eyes. Then a soft smile spread across her lips. "Michael," Claire whispered, her voice as tender as a lover's call. Alexander stiffened. Michael? Who the hell was Michael? He opened his mouth to correct her, but before he could react, she moved closer, slowly, almost dreamlike. Her hand slid up around his neck, her breath laced with the scent of alcohol and a faint trace of sweet perfume. Alexander tensed, muscles coiling at the unexpected closeness. "Stay with me tonight, please," she murmured, her voice dazed, but carrying an irresistible allure. Alexander felt his breath hitch slightly. She truly thought he was someone else. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind in an instant. He could push her away. He could call hotel security, could do anything to put an end to this bizarre encounter. But then something in him stopped him from doing so. Not because of the alcohol, but because of the way she looked at him, lost, vulnerable, yet full of an aching desire, as if she were searching for safety, for a place to belong. Alexander had no idea who she was, no idea what kind of story had led her to this moment, but in that instant, he found himself being pulled into her world. What he didn't know was that this one mistaken encounter would change his life forever. The morning after, The morning sunlight filtered through the thick curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the hotel room. A gentle light that, despite its warmth, mercilessly exposed a harsh reality. Claire stirred slightly, her body feeling heavy as if weighed down by an invisible force. A dull ache ran down her spine, radiating through her muscles with each movement. Her head throbbed painfully, as if 1,000 needles were piercing through her skull, each cell screaming from the after-effects of alcohol. Slowly, she opened her eyes, her eyelashes fluttering as consciousness returned to her. And then the sight before her made her heart pound violently. A stranger was lying beside her. He was fast asleep, his breathing slow and steady, his broad, muscular chest rising and falling rhythmically under the morning light. His strong arm rested close to her, his bare torso barely concealed by the white sheets. A tidal wave of shock crashed over her, sweeping away all rational thought. Claire shot up as if she had been electrocuted, but a wave of dizziness struck her instantly, making her stumble backward. The white sheets fell off her body, exposing her bare skin, and in that instant, pure horror set in. No, this can't be happening. Panic surged through her veins as she frantically grabbed the sheets, wrapping them tightly around herself. Her breathing turned ragged, her chest constricting as if there wasn't enough air in the room. What had she done? Who was this man? Claire clutched her head, her mind screaming desperately, trying to piece together the fragments of last night. She remembered drinking too much, Vanessa leading her out of the party, stumbling through the hotel hallway. But after that, everything was a blur. She couldn't remember a single thing beyond that point. But one thing was painfully clear. The man lying next to her was not Michael. How could this have happened? Her heartbeat pounded so violently that she could barely breathe. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, drowning her in a paralyzing panic. And then the man beside her stirred. Alexander's dark eyes flickered open, locking onto Claire's terrified gaze. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his face, but it disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a composed calmness. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep, deep yet cautious. Claire shook her head repeatedly, her eyes wide with shock, her breath coming in short gasps. No, this can't be. She couldn't bring herself to say the words. Alexander sat up, watching her carefully, his expression unreadable but laced with quiet understanding. Her face said everything. She had no idea what had happened, he realized immediately. "Calm down." Alexander spoke again, his voice steady, trying to anchor her from spiraling further into panic. But that only made her more terrified. She stared at him, as if he were an unbearable nightmare. Who are you?" she gasped, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. Alexander exhaled slowly, as if preparing for this. "I'm Alexander," he said. "Last night, you walked into my room, and—" he hesitated, not wanting to make things worse. "You called me Michael." Claire froze. No. She had mistaken Alexander for Michael. A sickening realization clawed its way into her chest. Not only had she betrayed the man she loved, but she had done it in a drunken haze, unable to even recognize who she was with. She couldn't bear it. Without another word, she scrambled to grab her clothes, her hands trembling so much that she couldn't even zip up her dress properly. She bolted toward the bathroom and slammed the door shut. Claire stood before the mirror, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She saw herself reflected in the glass, a broken version of herself, wide-eyed with shock, her skin pale and lifeless. What had she done? Had she just destroyed her entire life? Desperate, she turned on the faucet, splashing cold water onto her face. But nothing could wash away the horror and regret clawing at every fiber of her being. She wanted to turn back time. She wanted to wake up and realize this was all just a nightmare. But the reality was she was here. The reality was she had spent the night with a stranger. Her first time had been given to someone she didn't even know. And in just a few days, she was supposed to be married. And the worst part, she couldn't change any of it. She had to get out of here. Claire bolted out of the hotel room as if she were being chased. Her heels clattered against the polished floor, each step frantic, chaotic. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might explode. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She couldn't face the man she had woken up beside. Couldn't meet those deep, unreadable eyes that held confusion, but also something else she refused to acknowledge. Alexander remained standing at the doorway, leaning against the frame, his gaze following her retreating figure as she disappeared down the hallway. But Claire didn't care. There was only one thought in her mind. She had to escape. She nearly tripped as she stumbled into her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her. Her back pressed against the cold wooden surface, her fingers digging into it as if trying to ground herself. She felt like she was suffocating. Everything around her felt foreign. She dragged herself toward the mirror, and when she saw her own reflection, she froze. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her lips dry and cracked. She didn't even recognize herself anymore. Her once pristine white dress was now wrinkled, the faint scent of alcohol still clinging to her skin, and on her neck, subtle traces of pinkish marks, remnants of a night she couldn't even fully remember. Her hand trembled as she reached up, touching her reflection in the mirror. How had she let this happen? And then, like a tidal wave, fragments of last night came crashing into her mind. She had been drunk. She had walked into an unfamiliar room. She had called out for Michael, but the man who had answered her wasn't him. She clenched her fist, her nails digging into her palm, but the pain did nothing to bring her clarity. She had betrayed Michael. No, she whispered. This couldn't be real. What was she supposed to do now? A voice whispered in her mind. No one knows. Just forget it. Bury it forever. If you don't say anything, Michael will never find out. Yes, if she said nothing, if she pretended everything was normal, then maybe it would all just go away. The wedding would still happen. She would still become Michael's wife. She would still have the life she had always dreamed of. All she had to do was forget. But then another voice, louder this time, darker and impossible to ignore. But can you forgive yourself? Her chest tightened. How could she hide this? How could she start a marriage with a lie this enormous hanging over her head? Michael loved her. He trusted her completely, and she had betrayed him. She squeezed her eyes shut as a single tear rolled down her cheek. She could keep this secret, but could she live with it? No, she couldn't live a lie, even if it cost her everything. Even if she lost Michael, she had to tell the truth. Claire took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Michael's number. Her throat felt tight, her voice barely above a whisper, but she knew this was something she had to do. Michael, I need to tell you something. Claire stepped into the cafe, her hands gripping the hem of her coat, her palms ice cold despite the warm weather. She had spent the entire night thinking, agonizing, fighting against herself, but in the end, she knew she couldn't hide the truth. Michael was already there, waiting for her, his face lit up with happiness, his eyes gleaming with love the moment he saw her. He had no idea that within minutes his entire world would come crashing down. Claire. He stood up, pulling out a chair for her. You're here. Should I order for you? Do you want a cappuccino or a latte? Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. Michael's smile faltered slightly as he noticed the unusual look in her eyes. What's wrong? You look tired. Claire bit her lip, trying to steady her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Michael, her voice was barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something. His gaze softened, his smile fading as concern flickered in his eyes. What is it? He asked gently. Claire clenched her hands even tighter, her heart pounding violently, threatening to shatter inside her chest. And then, in just a few short minutes, she told him everything. Michael's entire world collapsed. He sat there in complete silence, The cafe seemed to fall into a suffocating stillness, the air thick with an unbearable weight. The only sound left was his ragged breathing. His face turned pale, his eyes vacant. She could see his jaw tighten, his fists clenching so hard that his knuckles went white. And then his voice came, low, quiet, but chilling. You're joking, right? Claire shook her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. I wish this was just a nightmare, Michael, she whispered, her voice breaking. But it's the truth. I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't even remember how it happened. Enough. Michael's palm slammed against the table, the sound like thunder in the quiet cafe, making Claire flinch. A few customers turned to look, but Michael didn't care. The pain was too much to contain. He stared at her, his eyes no longer filled with warmth, but with betrayal. You cheated on me right before our wedding, he said, his voice thick with anger and heartbreak. And you expect me to forgive you just because you didn't mean to. His voice trembled, heavy with fury, pain, and disbelief. Claire lowered her head, her tears dripping onto the table. Michael, I love you. Don't say that. He leaned back, as if trying to breathe, as if the weight of her words was suffocating him. And when he looked at her again, his gaze was different. Gone was the man who loved her. In his place was someone who had lost all faith in her. Everything we had, everything we built, meant nothing to you. His voice was hoarse, nearly a whisper. Claire shook her head frantically. No, it's not like that. I never wanted this. I don't even remember what happened. Michael let out a bitter laugh, a hollow, lifeless sound that cut through her like a blade. But it did happen, Claire. And that's all that matters. Claire reached for his hand, desperation in her eyes. Michael, please don't do this. But he only stared at her as if the woman in front of him was no longer the same person he had once loved. This is over. Michael stood up. There was nothing more to say. There was nothing left to save. He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with devastation, disappointment, and a pain so deep that it stole away any words she could have said. And then he walked away. Claire remained frozen in place, her heart shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. In just one night, she had lost everything. The man she loved, the wedding she had dreamed of, the future she had imagined. All that was left was a mesh she could never undo. Vanessa stood before the mirror, the corners of her lips curling into a satisfied smile. The wedding was off. She had just received the news from a mutual friend. Michael and Claire had broken up. She could vividly imagine Claire's devastated expression, the agony of losing the man she loved the most. Finally, justice had been served, Vanessa thought. On the outside, she played the role of a concerned friend, pretending to sympathize with Claire's misfortune. But deep inside, she was basking in triumph. With Claire out of the picture, Michael would come back to her. The moment she heard the news, Vanessa wasted no time in seeking out Michael. She knew he was in pain, and this was the perfect moment to step in, to be the comforting presence he needed. She found him at a bar near his office, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey, staring blankly into the amber liquid. Vanessa carefully approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice dripping with concern. Michael, I'm so sorry to hear about this. Michael didn't react immediately. She continued, her tone soft and soothing. I know this must be so hard for you. Claire, she never deserved your love. Michael took a slow sip of his drink, still silent. But what Vanessa failed to realize was that his silence wasn't from heartbreak, it was from rage. She didn't know that her perfect plan had been exposed. A mutual friend had overheard her conversation with a hotel staff member, the very person she had secretly paid to keep quiet about what had really happened. The truth had spread quickly, and finally, Michael knew everything. When he looked up at her, his expression had changed completely. There was no sadness, no heartbreak, only fury. You did all of this. His voice was low and strained, each word laced with barely contained rage. Vanessa froze. She stammered, "Michael, I don't understand what you're talking about." "Drop the act." Michael's tone was razor sharp. "I know everything. You set this all up. You got Claire drunk. You led her to that hotel. You destroyed everything." Vanessa's face went pale. This wasn't possible. She had planned everything meticulously. How had it all unraveled? Desperately, she tried to salvage the situation. "Michael, I was only trying to protect you. Claire didn't deserve you. She—" "Shut up." It was the first time Michael had ever raised his voice at her. "You loved me so much that you ruined Claire's life for it." His voice was filled with nothing but disgust. Vanessa stood frozen, speechless. His words cut through her like a knife. For so long, she had convinced herself that she loved Michael, that everything she did was for him. But now, looking into his eyes, filled with nothing but hatred and contempt, she realized the truth. She had never truly loved him. She had only wanted to possess him. "Michael, Her voice was barely a whisper. Michael shook his head. "I never want to see you again. We're done. No anger, no lingering emotions, just an ending." Vanessa stood there, motionless, watching as Michael turned and walked away. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of loss. Claire had lost everything. But in the end, Vanessa was the one who had lost the most. This time, there was no way to fix it, no way to take it back. She had destroyed everything with her own hands, and now all she had left was herself. New beginnings. Claire quietly pulled her suitcase out of the small apartment she had once filled with countless memories of Michael. Her breath was heavy, but her eyes were dry. She had cried enough. Everything in this city reminded her of the past. The little cafe on the corner where they spent hours talking about nothing and everything. The park in the crisp autumn afternoons where Michael would hold her hand and talk about the future. This apartment once filled with laughter and promises. But now, all of it was nothing more than the remnants of a shattered dream. She couldn't stay here anymore. Claire pulled her suitcase through the doorway without looking back. New York welcomed her with the sharp chill of early autumn, the bustling streets, and towering skyscrapers that stood like pillars of endless opportunity. This was where she would rebuild herself. She rented a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, not luxurious, not as comfortable as before, but enough. Enough to have her own space to reflect, to piece herself back together. Her days began in front of the computer, scrolling through job listings, sending out applications to every company she thought she had a chance with. Mornings started with bitter coffee. Nights ended with the dim glow of her laptop screen. She had no time to dwell on sadness, no time to reminisce about the past. The only option was to move forward. Weeks passed. Rejections flooded her inbox. Anxiety gnawed at her confidence. Could she really start over? Was she strong enough to make it? But then, on a cold morning, a different email appeared. "Congratulations. You have been selected for the position of project assistant at Blackwood Corporation." For a moment, her heart stopped. She did it. Blackwood Corporation, one of the most prestigious technology firms, a dream for so many. And now she was about to be part of it. The towering Blackwood building loomed in front of her, its sleek glass panels reflecting the golden hues of the rising sun, swallowing the vast sky of New York. Claire stood at the entrance, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Today was the start of something new. Adjusting her crisp white blouse and smoothing down her black pencil skirt, she stepped forward. Her pulse quickened, a mix of nerves and excitement thrumming through her veins. Inside, men and women in tailored suits moved with purpose, their conversations brisk and professional. The atmosphere was overwhelming yet electrifying. She followed the instructions she had received, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the top floor, the executive level where the orientation meeting for new hires would take place. She had no idea that her past was waiting for her at the end of this elevator ride. The door slid open, and Claire stepped into the conference room. Then she froze. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. Sitting at the head of the table, exuding an air of cold authority, was Alexander. No, this couldn't be real. What was he doing here? But nothing was wrong. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't a mistake. Alexander was the CEO of Blackwood Corporation. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. She couldn't breathe. Claire felt the world around her fade into a muted blur. The other employees were engaged in casual conversation, shuffling papers, exchanging introductions, but she could only register him. Alexander had seen her too. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across his features, but just as quickly, he masked it, regaining his composed, unreadable expression. A polite professional smile curved his lips, but his eyes were anything but indifferent. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe past the erratic pounding in her chest. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't just turn and leave, couldn't pretend she hadn't seen him. She had to sit down. She had to act normal. She had to pretend that nothing had ever happened between them, as if she hadn't woken up beside him that morning. The meeting went on as usual for everyone but Claire. Alexander spoke about the company's vision, about the upcoming business strategies, but his words barely registered in her mind. She was hyper-aware of every fleeting glance he threw her way, every subtle shift in his tone when his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. And the worst part, she had no idea what he was thinking. Was he amused? Annoyed? Did he find this situation ridiculous? Did he even care? One thing was certain, she didn't want to find out. But fate had other plans. As the meeting wrapped up, employees slowly filed out, leaving only a few lingering to gather their notes. And then his voice cut through the air. Claire. She froze, and her grip tightened around her folder. She couldn't pretend she hadn't heard him. Slowly, she turned, forcing her voice to remain steady. Hello, Alexander. He leaned slightly against the table, his gaze sharp yet laced with something unreadable. I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did she. She swallowed hard. If my presence is an issue, I can. There's no need. He cut her off smoothly, his tone level but unreadable. A faint, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. I think this is an interesting coincidence. For him, maybe. For Claire, it was anything but. In the days that followed, Claire did everything in her power to avoid Alexander. She minimized her presence in meetings where he was present. If she wasn't required to speak, she stayed in the background, keeping her head down, hoping to blend into the sea of employees. If she saw him approaching the elevator, she would wait for the next one, willing to be late just to avoid being trapped in a confined space with him. She declined lunch invitations from colleagues who were close to Alexander, even if it made her seem distant or antisocial. She built walls, deliberate, invisible, impenetrable. But Alexander wasn't the type of man to ignore something when he felt a connection, and Claire was about to learn that running from him would only make him chase her harder. Alexander had noticed. He knew she was avoiding him, and that only made him more intrigued. At first, Alexander thought their encounter was just a strange coincidence, an unfortunate incident, a night lost in the chaos that perhaps both of them wanted to forget. But the more he watched her, the more he realized that Claire was unlike any woman he had ever met. She was intelligent, hardworking, resilient. She wasn't like the women who usually approached him, the ones who cared only for his status, his wealth. Claire didn't need him, and perhaps that was what made him want to get closer to her. One late evening, with the office lights dimming as most of the staff filtered out for the night, Claire was still at her desk, her eyes glued to the screen, focused on finishing her report before leaving. She didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching from behind. Then came a low voice, smooth but commanding. Can we talk for a few minutes? Claire froze. She turned, her eyes locking onto Alexander standing at the door, his calm yet powerful presence filling the room. She couldn't run now. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen him. She had to stay. She had to keep her composure, as if nothing had ever happened, as if she hadn't woken up beside him that morning. Alexander didn't force the issue, but he didn't let her completely slip away either. He invited her to important meetings, gave her challenging projects that kept her involved. He created opportunities for them to talk privately, making it seem casual, but Claire knew better. Everything he did had an underlying purpose. She tried to keep her distance, but Alexander's patience was both unnerving and formidable. Gradually, she began to see another side of Alexander. He wasn't just a cold, powerful CEO like she had initially assumed. He had depth. He was tough on work, but it wasn't out of arrogance or selfishness. He genuinely cared about the growth of each employee, especially her. He didn't offer praise easily, but when he did, it carried weight. It made her feel challenged, driven, rather than manipulated. He listened when she spoke. He noticed the little things, the signs when she was tired, or when she was hiding something. She began to realize that he wasn't just interested in her for a passing amusement, but that in itself terrified her. Because the more she saw of Alexander, the more she realized how difficult it would be to run away from him. Claire was terrified. Terrified that if she allowed herself to feel anything for Alexander, the painful past would repeat itself. Terrified that if she opened her heart, she would lose everything once again. Terrified that, once more, she would hurt herself. She wasn't ready to love anyone. She had convinced herself that she was strong enough to stand on her own, that she no longer needed anyone else to enter her life. But then Alexander appeared with his patient gaze, with his concern, subtle but never absent, with his words that made her pause, made her question herself. "I won't let you keep running away." No matter how hard she tried, fate didn't give her the choice, because Alexander's feelings for her were growing stronger by the day, and she knew if this continued, she wouldn't be able to stop herself from falling any further. Unexpected news. Claire sat motionless on the bed, her trembling hand clutching the ultrasound result. Inside her heart was a storm, emotions crashing against each other in a chaos she couldn't control. She was pregnant. She had seen the tiny form on the ultrasound screen earlier that day, a small, faint shape, but undeniably a life growing inside of her. She gently placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the shift in her body, something she had never imagined before. A new life was beginning, a child of hers and Alexander's. The fear swelled inside her, pulling her into a vortex with no escape. This wasn't a small matter. This wasn't just a shock. This was a life-altering event. She wasn't ready. She couldn't be ready. Claire shut her eyes, and the memories of the past rushed back like a nightmare. She remembered that fateful night, the moment she walked into Alexander's room, called out a different name, the warmth of him, the tenderness and confusion in his eyes, the moment she lost everything. There was only one man who could be the father of this child, Alexander. She looked down at her hand where Michael's engagement ring had once been. Though it had been removed long ago, the mark of the past still etched deeply in her heart. She had lost him. She had lost the future they had once built together. Now she was about to be a mother, but to a child with a different man. She didn't know how Alexander would react if he knew the truth. Would he feel obligated, or would he truly want to be a part of her child's life? She couldn't know. She didn't want to take that risk, because if he stayed out of duty, it would be worse than if he left. She couldn't let Alexander feel bound by responsibility alone. Claire's breath shook as she stared at the ultrasound result. Part of her wanted to tell the truth, another part wanted to bury it forever. She decided to keep the secret. No matter what happened, this would be her child, only hers. In the weeks that followed, Claire tried to keep her life as normal as possible. She worked. She avoided Alexander as much as possible. She quietly went to her doctor's appointments alone, concealing her pregnancy with loose clothing. But her body couldn't keep the secret forever. Alexander noticed something was off with Claire. She wasn't as energetic as before. She seemed distracted in meetings, and it looked like she was trying to avoid him even more than usual. He began watching her more closely. And then one day, the truth came out. One night, the Blackwood office was nearly empty. Most of the employees had gone home long ago, leaving only the dim light from Claire's desk. She sat at her computer, eyes focused on the numbers, trying to finish her final report for the day. A slight pain in her stomach made her wince. She instinctively placed a hand on her abdomen, a habit she couldn't control. She had started to feel the baby's presence, but she couldn't let her emotions get in the way of her work. Sighing, she stood and left her desk, heading outside to get some water. On her desk, her purse was slightly open, and inside, a stack of her pregnancy documents peeked out. Alexander stepped into the office. He had come to discuss an important project, but Claire's office was empty. He furrowed his brow, about to turn around, but his eyes accidentally flicked over to a piece of paper lying on the desk, a small stack of documents with printed words that made him freeze. Pregnancy record. Patient name. Claire Anderson. Alexander's heart felt like it was being crushed. In an instant, he reached out and grabbed the ultrasound paper. The date, the gestational age. He stared at the numbers that told him an undeniable truth. This child was his. The world seemed to freeze in that moment. A rush of questions flooded his mind, each one a piercing blade cutting through his chest. Why hadn't she said anything? How long was she planning on hiding this from him? His grip tightened on the paper, his eyes darkening. He placed the file back on the desk, took a deep breath, and tried to steady himself. Just then, the door opened. Claire stepped in, holding a glass of water, but when she saw the serious look on Alexander's face, she froze. She immediately knew. The file had been turned over. The ultrasound paper was right there, exposing the secret she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. Her heart seemed to stop. Alexander didn't need to ask. He already knew. Claire took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. Alexander, I can explain. But Alexander didn't give her a chance to come up with an excuse. His voice dropped, thick with anger. How long were you going to keep this from me? Claire stiffened. She could see the disappointment in his eyes. Not just anger, but hurt. He felt betrayed. She opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, then took a deep breath, trying to contain the emotions rising within him. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was lower now, but still sharp. Did you plan to keep this secret forever? Claire clenched her hands, guilt rising up inside her. I didn't want you to feel obligated, she spoke softly, avoiding his gaze. I didn't want you to stay with me out of duty. Alexander laughed, a hollow laugh, but one that carried a storm of emotions beneath it. You think I'm the type of person who would do that? Claire fell silent. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could trust him anymore. Alexander watched her for a long time, his eyes filled with emotions he couldn't decipher. Then slowly he spoke again, each word clear, more resolute than ever. Claire, this isn't just your problem. This is our child. You don't get to make decisions for both of us. Claire's heart pounded erratically. She had prepared herself for Alexander's anger. She had prepared herself for him to refuse responsibility. But she never expected he would actually want to stay with her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she could let him into her life. She didn't know if, once again, opening her heart would mean losing everything. Alexander didn't force her to answer immediately, but he didn't leave. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words. The room grew silent, the only sound being the soft glow of the desk lamp and Claire's labored breathing. Alexander stood before her, his gaze never leaving her uncertain eyes. The pregnancy file was still there, revealing the truth she had desperately tried to hide. There was no way to run now. Claire took a deep breath, feeling her defenses crumble piece by piece. She was exhausted from keeping everything locked inside, exhausted from the old pain that still clung to her. She didn't know why, but in that moment, with Alexander's unwavering gaze upon her, She wanted to say everything. She stepped back, leaning against the desk, her eyes drifting to the floor. "Do you know?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of deep sorrow. "I was about to get married." Alexander wasn't surprised. He had already suspected, but he wanted to hear it from her. She continued, each word slicing into her heart. "Michael was the man I loved with all my heart. I thought with him, I'd have everything." She let out a bitter laugh. "But I destroyed it all." Alexander frowned slightly, hating the way she was blaming herself. He knew something was off in her story. "Why do you say that?" His voice was low but sharp, the question carrying the weight of his growing concern. Claire looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain that had never faded. "Because I betrayed him." Alexander's fist clenched, but he didn't interrupt her. "The night before the wedding, I was with another man." She bit her lip, still unable to fully accept the truth. "Even though I didn't mean to, it happened, and he couldn't forgive me." The room fell silent. Alexander's chest tightened, not because of that night, not because of how they met, but because she had to carry this burden alone. She had lived with that guilt, drowning in it, too afraid to open her heart again. Alexander took a step closer, closing the gap between them. He placed his hand on the desk, looking at her for what felt like an eternity. "Claire." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't care about your past." She flinched. He continued, his voice steady, almost like a promise. "I care about you, Claire." Claire felt her heart skip a beat. Alexander's gaze was unwavering, unflinching. "I care about you, Claire." The words pierced through every wall she had carefully built around herself. She had prepared herself for his anger, his reproach, for a fight. But not this. She wasn't ready for such an unshakable sincerity. Claire bit her lip, turning away, trying to avoid his unwavering gaze. "You're not responsible for me just because of the baby." Alexander let out a low, frustrated laugh. He gently but firmly raised her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do you really think this is just about responsibility?" Claire's heart raced. She wanted to escape. She wanted to push all the feelings away, to turn her back like she had done for so long. But this time, Alexander wouldn't let her. He looked at her, his gaze a mix of anger, hurt, and above all, something much deeper. "I don't care about you just because you're carrying my child." He tilted his head, his voice softening, as if he were confessing his deepest truth. "I care about you because you're you." Claire could hardly breathe. It felt like the world was spinning around her. She wasn't ready for this, but her heart was betraying her logic. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she could accept him. But one thing she knew for sure. Alexander wouldn't leave. He wouldn't let her keep running away. And this time, she had to face her true feelings. Crossroads. New York on a gentle rainy afternoon. Claire had just stepped out of the office after a long day. Her mind still spun with the conversation she had with Alexander. His words echoed in her mind. "I don't care about you just because you're carrying my child. I care about you because you're you." She didn't know what to do. She had thought the hardest part would be facing Alexander and the baby growing inside her. But fate didn't give her time to think. A familiar voice broke through the quiet hum of the city. "Claire." She froze. Her heart stopped. Slowly turning around, she saw Michael standing there. Michael still looked the same, but something had changed. His face was a little more gaunt, his eyes carrying exhaustion and regret. He stood there, looking at her as if he had traveled miles just to reclaim what he had lost. A cold breeze brushed past her, but Claire no longer felt it. "Michael," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Michael took a step toward her. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low but filled with deep pain. I didn't trust you, and I lost you." Claire felt her throat tighten. Each of his words was like a knife cutting into old wounds, pulling her back to a time when she loved him with all her heart, when she believed they had a future together. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She had changed. Everything had changed. Claire swallowed hard, trying to remain calm. Michael, she couldn't keep this from him. She couldn't keep him in the dark any longer. Taking a deep breath, she looked him in the eye. I'm pregnant. Her words dropped into the air between them like a bomb. Michael froze. He stared at her as if trying to understand whether he had heard wrong. Claire saw the pain flash in his eyes, only for a moment, but she saw it, the pain of a man who had lost the woman he once loved. Michael took a deep breath. With Alexander? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. Claire nodded quietly, silence stretching between them. Michael looked down, as if trying to control a storm raging inside him. But when he looked up again, his eyes were more determined than ever. I still love you, Claire. Claire froze. I can accept the child as my own if you give me a chance. The world seemed to stop in that moment. Claire felt as though she was being pulled in two different directions. She looked at Michael. He was her first love, the person she once thought she would spend her entire life with, the one she believed would be her final destination. She had loved him with all her heart, with everything she had. But then she looked down at her stomach. She thought of Alexander, the man who had entered her life in the most unexpected way, yet was becoming a part of it she could no longer imagine without. He wasn't the man she had once loved, but he was the one who hadn't turned his back on her. Claire didn't know who she truly loved. She didn't know if she could go back to the past, or if she should move forward into the future. She didn't know what her heart was telling her. But she knew, no matter who she chose, she wouldn't be able to hurt the other without feeling her own heartbreak. She didn't want to make a choice, but in the end, she knew she would have to. It didn't take Alexander long to find out Michael had returned. The gossip spread quickly through the office. The curious glances, the small conversations between colleagues. It wasn't hard for Alexander to piece everything together. Michael, the first love of Claire's, the one she had once wanted to spend her life with, the one she had cried for losing. And now he was back, just as Claire was facing the biggest decision of her life. Alexander knew what that meant, but it didn't make him step back. Claire sat alone in the cafe, gently stirring her cup of tea, but not really drinking. She was thinking about everything, about Michael, about Alexander, about a future she didn't know where it was heading. She sensed Alexander's presence the moment he entered the cafe. She didn't even need to look up to know he was near. When he sat down opposite her, she felt her heart tighten. There was no anger, no accusations, only deep understanding in his gaze. I heard Michael has returned, Alexander said, his voice calm. But there was something deeper behind it. Claire nodded slightly. She didn't need to hide anymore. She knew Alexander would know. He didn't look away from her, his gaze steady but unable to conceal his sincerity. I don't want to pressure you, Claire. She looked up at him. I respect your decision. His voice was warm, confident, as if he had thought long and hard before saying this. Claire's heart raced, her thoughts spinning. Alexander didn't pressure her to choose immediately. He didn't force her to answer, but he wasn't going to step back. But I still want you by my side. Claire swallowed hard. His words were simple, but they shook her to the core. Alexander didn't say, choose me. He didn't say, forget Michael. He simply said he wanted her, sincerely, with no pressure, no conditions. I've always been waiting for you. The words echoed in the quiet of the cafe, making Claire's heart beat erratically, uncontrollably. She looked at Alexander. He wasn't the man of her past. He wasn't the old dream she once chased, but he was the one who was always here, always ready to wait for her. And for the first time, she truly felt confused by her own emotions. She didn't know if she could love Alexander, but she knew he wasn't asking her to choose right now. And she also knew he wouldn't leave. Not ever. Claire sat on the bench in the park, her eyes fixed on the trees swaying gently in the breeze. In the past few days, she had thought deeply about everything. She knew she couldn't delay this decision any longer. Michael sat beside her, waiting silently for the answer he had been longing for. He had given her time, space to think, but deep down, he knew that if she needed time to think about their love, then perhaps that love was no longer the same. "Claire, I love you," Michael said, his gaze sincere. "I know things have changed, but I'm willing to do anything to make us be together again. I don't care whose child you're carrying. I just need you." Claire took a deep breath, turning to look at him. She knew that what she was about to say would hurt Michael, but she couldn't deceive herself anymore. "Michael, I can't go back to you." A flicker of pain passed through Michael's eyes, but he kept his composure. "Is it because of Alexander?" Claire shook her head. "No, this has nothing to do with him. We can't go back to what we had just because of the past. I've hurt you, and I've changed. I'm no longer the girl who was once engaged to you." Michael looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Perhaps he had known the answer already, but he still hoped for a miracle. "I understand," he said finally, his voice light as a breeze. "As long as you're happy, I won't hold on anymore." Claire clenched her hands tightly in her lap. "Thank you for loving me, for being such an important part of my life. But now, I need to move on." Michael forced a smile, but his eyes spoke everything. "Then goodbye, Claire." He stood up slowly, leaving without a word. And for the first time, Claire didn't run after him to hold on. She had chosen her own path. Alexander stood at the door of Claire's apartment, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face showing a trace of concern. He knew she had met with Michael. He wasn't sure who she would choose, but no matter what, he still wanted her to be happy. The door opened. Claire saw him, a hint of exhaustion in her eyes, but no longer the confusion she had once carried. "Can I come in?" Alexander asked. She nodded quietly, stepping aside to let him in. The atmosphere in the room was still for a moment, until Alexander decided to speak. "I don't know what you've decided, but no matter what the outcome is, I still want to be there for you and the baby. Not because of responsibility, but because I truly want to." Claire looked up at him. Alexander continued, "I know we didn't start in the perfect way, but I believe that love doesn't always come from perfection. It can be built day by day, moment by moment. If you give me a chance, I'll show you that I'm not just the father of this baby, but I can be someone you can rely on." Claire felt a warm wave of emotion stirring her heart. Alexander had always been there. He didn't push her. He didn't force her to choose. He just waited, patiently, sincerely, and with affection. "You turned down Michael," she whispered. Alexander was momentarily surprised, but then he nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. "I don't know if I can love anyone again. I've lost faith in love," she sighed. "But if I can try again, I want to try with you." A smile slowly spread across Alexander's face. He gently took her hand, squeezing it softly. "I'll wait, no matter how long." Time passed, and Alexander was never in a rush. He stood by Claire when she needed him, but never forced her to respond to his feelings immediately. He took her to her doctor's appointments, patiently listening to the doctor explain every detail. He helped her clean the house, went shopping for baby clothes with her. He didn't just do it as a responsible father. He did it as a man who truly cared for the woman he loved. Gradually, Claire felt the resistance in her heart begin to fade. Alexander wasn't Michael, and she wasn't the girl she used to be. They had started from a mistake, but love didn't always come from perfection. What mattered was that they had chosen to rebuild instead of giving up. One late evening, after Alexander drove her home from a checkup, Claire instinctively grabbed his hand. Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with hope. "I think I'm ready to love you," she whispered. Alexander smiled, leaned down, and gently kissed her forehead. "I knew," he whispered. "I'd just been waiting for you to realize it." And for the first time after everything they had been through, Claire felt her heart finally at peace. She had made her choice, and it was the best decision of her life. Epilogue. 3 years later, Claire was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner when Alexander entered. He leaned against the doorframe, quietly watching her. She was still the woman he had fallen in love with from the very first moment, but now she was also the mother of his daughter, his partner, his anchor, the one person he never wanted to lose. "Do you know how long I've been standing here?" Claire suddenly asked without turning around. Alexander laughed and walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was just thinking, how did I get so lucky?" Claire smiled softly and tilted her head to rest against him. "I don't know either. Maybe it's fate." He kissed the top of her head. "Then what do you think fate has to say about you marrying me?" Claire froze. She turned to face him, her eyes wide in shock. And in that moment, he knelt down. A small velvet box appeared in his hand, and when he opened it, a sparkling diamond ring lay inside. "Claire." Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "We've been through so much together. You're not only the mother of my daughter, but you're also the one person I want to spend my whole life with. You may not have been sure about love at first, but I want you to know I've been sure about you from the very first moment. So will you marry me?" Claire felt her heart stop for a second. She had imagined this moment before, wondering how she would react if Alexander ever proposed. But nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming emotions that flooded her in that instant. She knelt down with him, tears streaming down her face. "Alexander, I don't need a ring to know I want to be with you for the rest of my life," she choked out. "But I want this moment to say that I agree." Alexander laughed, a light and happy sound. He gently slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a deep kiss. Their daughter Emma was sitting in her crib nearby, laughing joyfully, as if blessing her parents' union. Their wedding took place in a small, cozy garden filled with warmth and fresh flowers. It wasn't the extravagant wedding Claire had once dreamed of, but it was the perfect wedding she could have ever imagined. She walked down the aisle in a pristine white wedding dress, her eyes welling up with tears as she saw Alexander waiting for her at the end of the path. When she reached him, Alexander took her hand firmly, as if to convey a silent promise without words. They exchanged vows under the soft sunlight, in front of their loved ones. Michael was there too. He was no longer the broken man from years ago, but someone who had truly let go of the past and found his own path. When Claire saw him, he smiled and nodded. In the end, everyone found their own happiness. As Alexander leaned down to kiss Claire amidst the cheers of everyone, she knew that she had truly completed her journey. Life wasn't always perfect. Claire had made mistakes. She had lost, and she had once stood at a crossroads, not knowing which path to take. But she had learned that true love doesn't always start perfectly. Sometimes it stems from imperfections, from mistakes. What matters is whether both people are willing to work through them together. Happiness isn't about avoiding hardships. It's about knowing how to move forward after the falls. Forgiveness isn't only for others. It's also for yourself. In the end, love isn't about who comes first or last. It's about who stays. Alexander had stayed. He was her final choice, but also the best choice she had ever made. She was no longer the girl who feared love. Now she was the woman who had found her own happiness. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul and Real Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below if you believe that true love can withstand all trial and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.